Hi, this is my review of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master Guide. This guide for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or AD&D, I feel it's a bit more, it's not as good as the other two core books, because this forms part of the three core books for AD&D, which is the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master Guide, and the Monsters Manual. So, well, let's talk about the quality of the book first. The quality is similar to the other two books. It's very sturdy, and the binding is good. Considering that I've used this book a lot, it's pretty good actually in terms of quality and sturdiness. There are some scratch marks here and there, but you can barely see them. But it's in pretty good state considering all the times that I played with this. Now the organization is decent as well. You will have trouble finding some things, but for the most part it's decent. And there are some illustrations that I will show you. There's kind of like a mixed bag. You have some pretty good ones and some pretty, I don't know, like they look pretty flat or something. You also have a table of contents, of course. Well, a good table of contents, because considering that the organization isn't quite that good, the table of contents is pretty good, and the index will help you move around the entire book. Well, let's talk about the contents. First of all, it gives you a very lame introduction on how to be a good dungeon master. It just gives you about 2 pages, giving very brief details, and it's kind of like the book is stating that it doesn't need to give tips on how to be a good dungeon master, and that's just silly, because it's a dungeon master guide. I know it's not a dungeon mastery guide, but it's still a guide, so they should give a bit more guidance, because back then it was really difficult to understand how to play the game if you didn't play the introductory box, or I don't know, another player showed you how to play the game. Well, you get a few methods on how to generate character statistics. Look at this illustration. I think this is one of the good illustrations. This illustration is pretty good as well. It has that kind of like old school, and I don't know, really nice. You also get the next chapter talks about PC races, or player character races, and I didn't like it how they handled races in general in AD&D. Well, if you decided to play as a dwarf or an elf or a halfling, you couldn't get to level 20. I mentioned this in my other review of the AD&D Player's Handbook. So a lot of players didn't choose those races because they felt like they were never going to reach their potential, their full potential. So the human was the only one who could level up to level 20 or even higher. And the book gives you some advice on how to I don't know, fix this. As in, maybe you can level up to level 20 with your dwarf, but you had a slower progression. That is, you needed more experience points in each level. And there was also quite bad that some races couldn't play as a certain character classes. So you wanted to play, I don't know, an elf paladin, you couldn't, or even maybe you wanted to play a dwarf wizard, you couldn't do that as well. There were other optional rules here. For example, if you had a really high prime requisite bonuses in your stats, you could level up a bit higher at certain classes. For example, if you wanted to be a dwarf cleric, you could get to level 14 or 15 if you had the right stats. But it still felt, I don't know, like it wasn't really well thought out. It's not like these races had too much of an advantage, because they mainly did this to find some kind of balance, because dwarves and elves and gnomes had different racial abilities that the human didn't have. But they didn't feel that powerful, especially at higher levels. So I prefer to handle it as the human getting a bonus to his stats, and all the other characters races would be able to reach level 20 because of it. This is an illustration that I was telling you about, that it looks pretty flat, like made out of paper or something, because you really can't tell. At first it may look like maybe that guy is stepping through a door and saying hi or whatever, but it also looks like he's made out of paper or something, and he's getting through the slit between the wall or the door, so it's a bit weird. The next chapter is about player character classes, and I think this chapter is a perfect example of how there's just too much fluff in this book when it should have more useful or important information, because they basically describe to you all the character classes, but if you read the player's handbook, you already have a pretty good idea of what each class is all about, so you didn't really need to read what a fighter was or a ranger. You already knew that. It feels just like a lot of fluff, unnecessary fluff. You do get some tips on creating new character classes and some of the finer points of character classes, and that's fine, but it could have been a lot better. This chapter could have included, I don't know, more advice. Maybe there's a lot of. They should have cut all that fluff in many of these chapters, and they should have added, I don't know, random tables to generate dungeons and more advice on how to handle site-based adventures and event-based adventures and so on. The next chapter is alignment. It also feels very fluffy. This illustration, I think, I always thought it was a bit funny. It kind of looks like a guy in a nightgown summoning a skeleton. And then the next chapter is also somewhat fluffy. It's about proficiencies. It's kind of trying to deal with the finer points of proficiencies, but as I told you in my other review of the player's handbook, the proficiency system wasn't that good. It has some interesting uses for strictly for role playing, but as a mechanic, as a rule, it felt like something that penalizes you instead of awarding you with better bonuses. You have another section on money and equipment, which is actually useful if you want to set your campaign on a specific timeline, maybe the Dark Ages or the Renaissance. You get all the details to carry out different monetary systems and all that. Now the next chapter, magic. This chapter, I didn't really like it because, well, it has some good details on how to about spell books and designing new spells, but it felt really rigid and kind of like it sets a tone of my way or the highway. So for example, let me read this paragraph to you. Currently, the different schools of wizard magic are merely sketched out and very lightly defined. The different schools can be used as described, but they lack detail and, in a few cases, a full range of spells. There are, for example, very few necromantic spells, thus discouraging player characters from being necromancer specialists. There is nothing wrong in this. Nothing requires schools of magic to be equal. So, and then it says, however, you might want to customize and expand the schools of magic to suit your campaign. So it's kind of like saying, oh yeah, we gave you these schools of magic and 2 or 3 of them are really lame, but that's okay. No, it's not okay because it's not fun for the player. If the player wanted to play a necromancer and you gave a really, I don't know, incomplete version of the school of thought of wizards, and that's of the necromancer or the diviner, that just sucks. It's really crappy. If you want, as I said in my other review, if you wanted to play a necromancer, you had to buy the necromancer's handbook, because otherwise you felt really like, I don't know, nerfed or gimped or something like that. And you get more tips about magic, researching extra wizard spells and determining spell components and all that. You get a very short chapter on experience, and it's just basically giving you points and tips on how to award experience points. That's actually quite useful. And the next chapter, Combat, gives you a lot of optional rules. Like it talks more about a weapon type versus armor modifiers. That is slashing and blunt and piercing weapons deal different are more effective when they impact different types of armor, maybe leather, plate, etc. You also get more optional modifiers to initiative with weapon speed and size modifiers. More rules on pole arms and shields, punching and wrestling, critical hits, parrying. There's also a very important rule. I think everybody used this rule because of the lethality of the game, which is the I think it was called hovering. Here it is, hovering on death's door. This basically means that if your character suffers damage and his hit points reach 0, you aren't dead. You're only dead when you reach -10 hit points. So this is a very useful rule, so you don't have to generate characters all the time. If your dungeon master is pretty, I don't know, pretty strict or gritty and he kills a lot of characters, this rule will help you. You also got a few rules on aerial combat and underwater rules. You have a chapter on treasure and magical items. Just a few details on how to place them and what scrolls and potions are. Oh, this illustration is pretty cool. Kind of like stealing a jewel eye or some sorts. There. You also get some sample artifacts and relics. Some pretty famous, like the Rod of 7 Parts, or the Hand of Vecna, or the Hand of Jack Vance. You also get a pretty good chapter on encounters. This is actually probably the best chapter when it comes to dungeon mastering in this book, because it actually tells you how to run encounters. They should have added more chapters about how to run adventures. You also get a chapter on NPCs and some hirelings and such. And this chapter could have been better. It's somewhat decent, but it should have included maybe information if you wanted to run your kingdom or your barony or whatever. Because I think it was in the player's handbook that it said, if your character wants to run a barony, ask your dungeon master and he will tell you how. And now, if he had just this book, it was going to be pretty hard for him to give you a well-structured system on how to run a kingdom. You get a chapter on vision and light, time and movement, all pretty basic stuff. A chapter with miscellaneous rules, so for example curses and magical diseases such as lycanthropy. More information on the inner planes and the outer planes of existence. And then you have a chapter with a lot of magical items and magical weapons, all sorts of things. This is probably the best chapter of the book. When I think about the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, the term or the concept of magical item compendium comes to my mind because this chapter is pretty big. You have all the purple sword, the holy defender, all sorts of armor, ring of the ram, ring of human influence, staff of withering, staff of thunder and lightning, all sorts of miscellaneous magic, the book of vile darkness, of course, the book of exalted deeds. All the famous items are right here. And at the end of the book you just get a few somewhat useful tables on special purpose of weapons, languages spoken by a weapon if you're designing an intelligent weapon. And that's basically it. Well, let me tell you what I think about this book. It's actually not that bad, but compared to the player's handbook and the monstrous manual, it feels like a really weak entry. It should have included more advice on how to run games. It had too much fluff, all those information about character classes, all that data that you already read about in the player's handbook. I don't know. It felt like it could have been a lot better. Still, you wanted to run AD&D, you needed this book, you needed the holy trinity of books of AD&D. So I guess it's not a bad good book, but it's certainly an example of how things could have been better if they only cut the fluff. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.